Chapter 3 When Shit Hits the Fan. Doc was held up behind a power generator as he took the oncoming blast from the ogler to his left and then his right. Then he ducked back into the abandoned halfway house for M's. No one had been to this halfway house in years, millennia probably. At least not since the oglers had taken command. They were deep in ogler country. The blast hit his shoulder. He felt the radiation burst in part of his skin, which deteriorated and melted into the air. "How's Pantheon doing, Roscoe? Is he making any headway into that head of Ed's?" asked Doc. Roscoe looked over at the bodies of the two unconscious space rangers, Pantheon and Daisy along with Ed. That's when Pantheon began to shudder in his coma. "Doc, we got a problem," replied Roscoe, who was applying a vial of clear red liquid to the IV hooked up to Pantheon's body. "He's seizing." Doc shot out the door one more time. The halfway house was a safe zone for now. They were advancing past Doc's barrier that he'd built using the generator. It could keep the oglers out, but not their firepower. Doc walked over to the body of Pantheon. Doc was wearing a long white lab coat, and Pantheon was beginning to froth in green alien blood. Doc tapped an organ somewhere in his knee, and Pantheon suddenly rose out of the coma screaming, "Don't make me go back in there, boss. Don't make me go back in there." He held on to Doc's shoulder as the educated man rocked him to sleep and tried to get him to calm down. The blood would soak back into his body soon, and then everything would be okay. "Did you get him? You're part of the formula?" asked Doc. Yes, I did, but he's in trouble. He's in the deep," replied Pantheon, as his body cooled and the green liquid soaked back in. Doc looked over at Daisy. She was out cold. "Well, it's her turn now," said Doc. He handed Pantheon the phaser and lay on the mat as Pantheon got up. "Don't go in there, boss. You'll never get out." "I barely escaped with my life. It's too dangerous," said Pantheon to Doc. "You know me, diver extraordinaire," replied Doc, with a smile/frown. Roscoe hooked up the IV, and Doc went under. That's when the first part of the barrier fell. They had hit the west side generator tube. "Damn oglers," replied Roscoe vehemently as he placed a piece of scratch paper into Doc's hand that he ripped off of a much larger piece of paper. That's when they heard the sentients. The large beast was ramming the next layer. "They're literally trying to burst our bubble," replied Roscoe to Pantheon, who was still in recovery. "Let's get you to the ship, Pantheon." Roscoe leaned the alien being onto his shoulder like he was a crutch, and they hobbled back into the way station. "I'm hungry, man," replied Pantheon. "We'll get you all the severed heads you can eat, buddy," said Roscoe. He looked back at Doc, Ed, and Daisy. "All the severed heads you can eat." As they got to the ship, they could feel the force being applied to the shield by one of the sentients. It was like 1,000 megatons. The call of the large creature echoed through the halfway house. There was the skeleton of an old M laying in the corner. He had been the welcomer, the last who would have stayed in case any wayward M's happened to visit the archipelago system. Poor guy. He didn't stand a chance. I could feel the ground shaking, but it didn't make sense. I was on a ship/spaceship. I could hear noises, too. Then I woke up from my nap. They threw a bucket of mop water in my face. It tasted salty, like I wasn't already filled to the brim. I had stashed the formula between my teeth, hoping the ink wouldn't bleed through. You think the roper was bad? Asked Tafters, petting his fur chinny chin. Wait until you meet the Duchess. Whatever, kitty cat, I yelled over the deck. I was above deck now and I could feel the weight of something getting to me. I was no longer lighthearted. It was like my whole identity had changed overnight. I looked out over the starboard side. I could see the stars. They were beautiful like Daisy. But where was Daisy? I loved that Russian broad. She always lightened my spirits. A man dressed as a woman came out of a portal in the sky and landed feet first on the deck. He or she had heels as black as night, with those little glitter thingies that you see dancers wear. You know, the ones from the other side of town. I heard a loud guttural belch as the being whom I assumed was the Duchess belched in my face. It was about the most acidic and disgusting torment I could think of. Okay, now that we're dissolving into juvenile torments, can you just... I said as my gut wrenched, and this time I puked up a fish. How did that get there? Then I looked over. Roscoe was standing above my right shoulder blade, and to the left Daisy was kneeling. She looked beaten up, but still she was my girl. I could feel the ground quaking again. Okay, will somebody tell me what this is? Daisy said with a half-toothed grin. Oglers, they're oglers, Ed. You've got to remember who you are. That's when I saw it again. The warehouse. No, it was the plant. Or was it a warehouse? We have to tell him. His life could be at stake here, Doc. Then Doc talked to somebody I couldn't see behind the steel beam. Get this to the lab quickly. We have to make it fast. Then he moved and I could see past the steel beam. It was Daisy. She was the one he was talking to. Yes, sir, she replied. Doc continued. The ogler's ogled for the last time. He's the last M I want to see in a body bag. Roscoe, we've got to help him before he goes further into his subconscious. Give me the paddles. That's when I saw it. I was lying in a coma on the bed. I sure hope she gets back in time to apply the antidote, otherwise Pantheon and her are diving in, said Roscoe. What do you mean you're perfectly capable, Roscoe? You were the best diver 10 years running in the Hungarian Corps, said Doc. Not me, Doc. I have a bad hypothalamus, replied Roscoe. After I drove into Nancy, I've never been the same since or ever. Oh, all right, Pantheon. Get your green-blooded arse over here, replied Doc, rolling up his sleeves and applying a shot to my arm. You'll go first. That's when I felt the ground shake again. What was that? I asked. The oglers ogled you, Ed. You have to save the formula. It's scattered through your subconscious. You have the last piece in the firmament, replied Daisy as she smiled, spitting up blood. Does everybody have to die? What is this, a cartoon? I asked Tafters, who looked at Daisy, holding a hook up to her throat. No, I was in a coma and I had to find something. Me, Ed Eisenhower. I had to save the day. Man, my subconscious was effed up. Why would I put myself through all of this just for some formula? Maybe that was what Tafters wanted. Hey, kitty cat, I yelled. Tafter smiled. Yes, he replied questioningly. Are you looking for a formula? I asked. Yes, replied the ferocious feline, touching his mustache. Me too, I said with a smile. Me too. Daisy came up sputtering blood. She felt the rumble of the planet. She was back from Ed's subconscious. What the? She started hyperventilating. Roscoe gave her some liquid to drink, and she felt her veins stop pulsating slowly. Did you get him the formula? He asked, interjecting between breaths. Daisy took a large gulp of oxygen. Yes, she said with emphasis. Back in the deep of his subconscious mind, Ed looked up at the cat who was smiling. Do you have it for me, Mr. Ed? He asked, with a vicious look. Let's make a deal, began Ed. He was trying to reach the piece of paper that Daisy had left on the deck of the ship before she died. It was being swished around in seawater. That's when another rumble hit. The second generator tube had been struck. One shield layer left. That's when Ed reached for the piece of the formula. He felt the paper warm against his skin like fire. It drafted up his arm and into his teeth and down into his throat, where it lodged. He has the formula, screamed Tafters. That's when Doc jetpacked onto the ship. He looked like he had been through hell. He pulled out a sword and began to fight off the pirates, one by one. He plunged Tafters in the heart, and the Maine Coon went down seething and erupted into flames. Come on, said Doc as he reached out his hand. Ed didn't have to be told twice. He got untied and grabbed Doc's hand, and they were off into the stars. As they approached, a rather large white dot kept getting bigger off in the distance until they were standing in a white room. Doc handed Ed a slip of paper, and it joined the others with a warm afterburn down his throat. This is as far as I go. You're on your own, kid. It was nice knowing you. Back in the warehouse, Doc erupted from his coma. He shivered. He was a damn good diver. Not a spot of blood, and he'd gone all the way to the Ed. The Oglers would have Ed for sure, unless he could get out of there alive. Doc sure hoped for a miracle. That's when he heard the sound of a jet engine. But it wasn't the SS Granville. No, the Space Rangers' ship couldn't fly. It had landed wrong when they hit the halfway house. Landings always were tricky. This was a much larger ship. Then there was a flash and a boom and radio static. It was a god ship. Who would be flying a god ship in the Archipelago system? And besides, nobody had visited this halfway house in 5 millennia. Not since the Oglers took over. I could feel the weight of my subconscious now. It was heavy like a rock on my chest. I was standing in a white room. There was a little boy drawing on a sketch pad with a red crayon. It was some of that child's paper. You know, the cheap stuff your mom bought at the supermarket because she could barely afford bread? And this was the best way to keep you busy? Well, if you don't know, then that's probably for the best. I knew that's all that mattered. I could no longer hear the sounds or feel the rumble. The room was completely silent. The boy was wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt. I noticed that the room looked like a pediatric psych ward. I leaned back on the balls of my feet and whistled. Then I tapped the kid on the shoulder.